Hey, it's Mike. Let's talk about Reaper. In today's episode, we'll be covering the basics of compression. A compressor is a great tool that can be used to help smooth out uneven performances, and you can also use a compressor to create movement on a track. Many new users and even a lot of experienced users are often intimidated by compressors. Even though the controls from one compressor to the next are very similar, they can still be a bit confusing. Learning the basics of how compressors work should help get over the fear and allow you to start practicing and get used to using compression in your mixes. Let's take a look. The project I have open is the same project that I provided multitracks for on my last video. If you haven't seen that video, be sure to click the link above to download the multitracks for your own practice. Since that video was released, my daughter has added vocals to help me to demonstrate compression. Let's take a look at the work in progress.
I can't pretend to know how you feel. Know that I'm here, know that I'm real. Say what you want, but don't talk at all. I'm not gonna let you fall. Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too. Everything changes, but one thing is true. Understand, will always be more than a reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too. Everything changes, but one thing is true. Understand.
We've still got a bit of work to do on that song before it has the type of clarity that I'd like, but it's sounding pretty good. I'll switch to another project that only contains her unprocessed vocals so we can take a look at how compressors work. This track is her vocals as recorded directly into the interface, with no compression, no EQ, no nothing. As you can see by looking at the waveform, there's a lot of variance in the volume of her performance. Let's take a listen.
I can't pretend to know how you feel. Know that I'm here. Know that I'm real. Say what you want, but don't talk at all. I'm not gonna let you fall. Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small.
The performance is not bad, but with compression we can smooth this out to get a lot more consistent performance. Let's add recomp to the track and take a look at how the controls work. Before we get too deep into what these controls do, I suppose we should discuss what a compressor even does. The simplest example that I can think of to explain what a compressor does is it's a type of automatic fader that will quickly turn down the volume of a track when the track is too high based on your settings. We'll take a look at some of these controls and adjust some settings, and we'll be able to render the file so you can visually see what the compressor is doing to the audio track. The first parameter that we'll look at is a threshold. The threshold tells the compressor when to start responding to a signal based on its volume level. Once the signal crosses the threshold, the compressor knows to start to turn it down based on other settings. Let's play a louder section of the track, and I'll adjust the threshold to see what happens.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them.
Now that might seem a little bit confusing because I've reduced the threshold well below the volume of the track, but nothing's happening. That's because our ratio is currently set at 1:1. A 1:1 ratio means that for every 1 decibel above the threshold that the signal goes, 1 decibel will come out. In other words, exactly what is going into the compressor is what comes out, with no change. If I leave my threshold at its current level but take my ratio up to 2:1 instead, that means that for every 2 decibels that goes above the threshold, 1 decibel will come out. Let's listen to a before and after.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too. Everything changes, but one thing is.
As you can hear, when I engaged the compressor, the track's volume was reduced. The meter to the left of the output in recomp shows gain reduction. That will tell us how much the volume is turned down. Let's watch that again.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too.
So we were getting roughly an average of -6 dB of gain reduction. If we'd like to turn it down even further, we can do that by lowering the threshold or by increasing the ratio. Let's change the ratio to 4 to 1 and see how that affects the sound. We'll leave all the other parameters the same.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too.
Now that's a much more aggressive compressor, but it seems to be doing a pretty good job of smoothing things out. We've still got some other settings that we can take a look at and make adjustments to make this performance even smoother. Let's take a look at the attack value. The attack value dictates how fast the compressor starts to work once the threshold is crossed. The current setting is 3 milliseconds, which means that once the threshold crosses negative 28.3 decibels, after 3 milliseconds past the threshold, it'll start to turn it down based on our ratio. A lower attack value means the compressor responds faster, and a higher attack value means that the compressor responds slower. The maximum value in Reacomp is 500 milliseconds, at least by using the slider. You can type in any value that you'd like. Let's try a setting of 500 milliseconds and watch how the... Belle, come sit down. I need you to be quiet while I'm recording, sweetheart. Sit down.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too.
Now, as you could see on the gain reduction meter as well as here, the performance was a lot jumpier now because the compressor is responding a lot slower than it was before. I don't think that that setting will work for this performance, so we'll need to bring this down to a more comfortable level. I'll leave it at its current setting and start to adjust it lower as we listen. Let's try to find a setting that gives us a bit smoother performance.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too. Everything changes, but one thing is true, understand.
That sounds a lot smoother than it did before, so let's leave that around 16 milliseconds for now. Our next parameter is the release value. If you watched the gain reduction meter before, you'll notice that after the compressor turns the volume down, it begins to return to the original value. The release value controls how quickly the compressor lets the signal return to its original volume. A lower release time will allow the volume to return to normal faster, and a higher release time will hold on to the gain reduction a lot longer. If we leave our attack time at the same place it is now, but turn our release value up as high as it'll go, let's see what happens.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too. Everything changes, but one thing.
You'll notice that the gain reduction meter is still working its way back to the original volume. That's because our release time is set to 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds. That's an awful long time. Now that definitely kept the volume a little bit smoother, but at the same time it sounded strange because it lacks punch in the vocal performance. You don't really hear the initial burst of sound that would come with speaking a word or singing a word. Let's reduce the release time while listening and see if we can find something that smooths out our performance better.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too. Everything changes, but one thing is true, understand. Will always be more than a reach for.
That sounds a lot smoother than our original performance. We've still got a few more parameters that we can take a look at. As it stands with our current setting, once the signal crosses the threshold, the 4-to-1 ratio is immediately applied. The knee size will allow a more gradual ramping up of the gain reduction. It's kind of hard to make that make sense, but if you find that the compressor sounds pretty good but maybe a little bit too aggressive or maybe too snappy for you, you can adjust the knee size to try to get the sound that you're wanting. Let's increase the knee size just a little bit and see how that affects the performance.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too. Everything changes, but one thing is true,
Now that sounds a bit better to my ear, but we still have a little bit of jumpiness, so we may want to let up on our threshold just a little bit to smooth this out.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on.
That's sounding pretty good. Let's listen to it before and after. We'll start with the compressor turned off.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but. Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can.
Now that sounds a lot smoother, but it also sounds a bit quieter. That's where makeup gain comes in. Some compressors will have a dedicated knob that says makeup gain. In Recomp, that's accomplished by adjusting the wet value. We can increase this a few decibels and get it to where it sounds about the same as it did before. I find it best to do this by ear as opposed to watching the gain reduction meter and trying to match that number exactly with the wet slider. Let's take a listen to before and after and see if we can get this pretty close to where it was before.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on them too. Everything changes, but one thing is true, understand.
That sounds pretty close. Well, we still have a few other parameters to take a look at here. Low-pass and high-pass filters on a compressor will allow you to adjust the signal that the compressor responds to. A good example of this is if you're working with compressing a drums bus and you don't want the compressor to react to the kick drum only. You can increase the high-pass filter so that the kick drum doesn't get compressed and the compressor focuses more on the rest of the kit. The same can be done with the low-pass filter if you wanted to filter out some higher frequencies. You can adjust this parameter until the compressor only responds to the sound that you want. In Recomp, we have a preview filter option to the right. If I click that, I can listen to the filtered performance to make sure that the compressor is responding to what I want.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you. Shoulders are small, but you can cry on.
With that setting, the compressor is only responding to frequencies between 148 Hz and 1014 Hz. Be sure to turn off the filter once you've found the frequencies that you want to focus on.
Reach for my hand, 'cause it's held out for you.
I'd like to take that back to where the compressor responds to the full spectrum though. This next setting you don't see on a whole lot of compressors, and if I'm honest, I'm not 100% sure that I know how to explain this. RMS size, to the best of my understanding, defines the length of time that the compressor listens to help it make its decision. A smaller RMS size means that the compressor will respond faster. A higher RMS size means the compressor will listen to a bit more before deciding to respond based on your attack and release values. It seems to be working fine with this vocal performance with a value of 5, so I'll just leave it there. Now that we've got the compressor set in a way that seems to work the way that we want, let's render this and see how it works visually. I'll right-click the track and apply track take effects to items as new take, mono output. Now that that's rendered, I'll close the compressor and we'll make this bigger so we can see the difference between the two tracks. I'll also hide my dock by pressing Alt-D. If we focus on the performance that we were listening to, take a look at this section here. We can see there's a significant difference between the higher and lower parts of the waveform, but as we look at the compressed signal, we can see that they're a little bit closer together. It may not seem like a whole lot of difference at that part there, but if we move further down the track, take a look at this section. Here we've got a lot of variance between the beginning of this phrase and the end, whereas on the lower track that's compressed, the difference between the beginning and the middle of this phrase are a lot closer together. And that's essentially what compression does. It reduces the dynamic range of a track and brings the higher parts closer to the lower parts and allows you to turn that track up overall to achieve a better volume output and a smoother performance. People are often confused by their tracks redlining but also not sounding as loud as they believe they should sound. That's typically because you have peaks that are much higher than the lower parts of your waveform. You can use compression to give you a higher average volume across the performance. Let's delete this track and go for some more extreme settings. I'll delete the active take, adjust our compressor settings to something ridiculous, and render that again. Now you can see our track is much quieter, but at the same time it's much more even. Again, that was an extreme setting, and I can't see where I would ever use this for a vocal performance, but that does clearly demonstrate what the compressor has done to the signal. So far, we've only used the compressor to smooth out an uneven performance, but we can also use the compressor to create the sound that we like. You can use a compressor on a drums bus to add more glue to the drums and make it sound more like a cohesive unit instead of several elements fighting each other for dominance. I like to use heavy compression on the room mics for my drums to give it a bit more punch and some saturation. Let's take a look. I'll solo my room mics, and we'll focus on that same part of music that we were listening to with the vocals. I currently have Recomp on this track, but I'll turn it off and let's take a listen. Now that's without compression. Let's take a look at the settings that I've got on the compressor and then we'll see how it sounds. I have an attack time of 10.5 milliseconds and a threshold of minus 27.3 decibels. I've got a release time of 20 milliseconds, a ratio of 10.2 to 1, which means that for every 10.2 decibels that crosses the threshold, only one will be allowed to go through. I've got a knee size of 6.4 decibels, which essentially just means that the compressor will respond gradually as opposed to instantly. I'll play that same piece again, and we'll turn the compressor on midway to see what it does to the sound. You can hear the saturation that the compressor has added. It gives the drums a bit of a crunchy sound, for lack of a better word. Now, if we adjust the attack and release times with drums, you'll start to hear the drums either sound more punchy or further away. Let's experiment with that on the room mics as well. I hope that you could hear that as I increase the release time, the drums begin to sound a bit more distant and less exciting. Let's play that same piece again, and I'll start to lower the release time. Listen very carefully to the snap and punchiness of the drums as I bring this value down. I want to try to bring that excitement back into the rooms. Now we're starting to get some of that excitement and energy back into the drums. That sounds good to me. Let's try before again. And after. Let's listen to that in context. I'll unsolo the room mic and bring the volume back down. And that's sounding pretty good. So far we've only covered Recomp, but the same controls will show up on other compressors. If I open the SSL channel that I've got on my snares, you can see that we have a compressor here with the threshold, release, and ratio. This particular compressor doesn't give me the option to set an attack time. It's got either an automatic or a fast response. But even so, we still see these same common controls here. Let's take a look at another. I've also got the Focusrite channel strip. I'll bring it over to the correct monitor. There we go. And here we've got the same controls: ratio, threshold, release, attack. This one has a makeup gain slider, and we also have a mix control. This allows you to blend the desired level of the compressed signal with the uncompressed signal. We've also got mastering compressors. The Shadow Hills mastering compressor, we still have some of the same controls. There's our threshold, makeup gain, ratio, attack and release times. Even though this may look like a scary compressor, it still has the same controls as Recomp. Now you may be wondering, if compressors have the same controls, why have so many? Different compressors can also have their own signature sound. The SSL compressor sounds different from the Focusrite compressor, and those sound different from the Shadow Hills or Acme compressor and several others. You may want to experiment with different compressors and see if you can find certain sounds that you like with certain materials. I realize we didn't go very deep into compression with this, but I really just wanted to focus on the basics of the compressor and help you to get used to what the controls mean. I hope this helps to give a little bit more clarity about how compressors work. With the new knowledge that you've got, it's time to start using it in your own mixes. I will say that there's not necessarily any right or wrong settings for compressors. It's all subjective, and the best thing for you to do is to get some source material and start to experiment and find what works for you and what doesn't. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. If you like the content you're seeing, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and you can support the channel further by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee link below. I like coffee. Oh, you're still here.